Peace and blessings. My name is Reverend Waltrina Middleton. I serve as the Executive Director with Community Renewal Society. I'm really honored to spend this time with my dear friend, Keron Blair, who serves as our manager for organizing and policy with Community Renewal Society. Keron is also just an organizer extraordinaire, brilliant, spiritual being that I really admire and respect. And so grateful to be able to share in this dialogue with you. Keron, I would welcome you to introduce yourself and share with us what brings you to this conversation.
So you said it, Keron Blair. I grew up in Jamaica, and I've lived in the United States now for about 20 years. In fact, became a citizen of the United States just last October. And so there's a sort of a complication, right, or a thing to navigate around being a citizen of this country and having, for me, what feels like a higher stake in the political direction. And so that's a part of what brings me here. It is an exercise of my own sort of newly acquired citizenship, and that what the American government does or does not do, in some way, I am a part of that. And that so it is important to me to both speak up and to take action. The second piece is I am constantly trying to figure out how to show up for people and communities who are living in duress. And I think when we think about the Israeli-Palestine conflict and the terror that folks are experiencing, you know, it is not difficult to come to the conclusion that the Palestinian people are living in duress, and living under duress and suffering. And I want to both speak up on that and also want to find ways to have public dialogue that moves people closer to our politic and to our view of raising up support for and calling for both peace, but also justice and fairness.
I think of the movement for Black Lives and just the response of communities that are often overlooked that have occupied the streets and put their bodies on the line for liberation movement. Mm-hmm. And often when we see images of resistance in Palestine, we see the images of the children throwing rocks and they are demonized. And I look at those children who with rocks are considered terrorists next to a militarized police system and government that can take them out of their beds in the middle of the night and literally murder them for the crime of throwing a rock. And then I look at the disparities in our prison industrial complex and the way Black and brown youth are criminalized for the stance that they take in the streets. And I'm wondering, as an organizer, how you view those parallels when we are speaking of resistance and movement for Black and lives.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I do think that there are some connections and some parallels, right? That there is a way in which we're talking about land and we're talking about placement when we talk about what's going on in the Middle East, right? And when we talk about Black Lives Mattering and Black Lives not mattering and where they matter, how they matter, and the struggle for that here, we're also talking about land and placement and how these bodies ended up here and the centuries of abuse and pain and suffering and imprisonment and enslavement that our Black bodies have suffered. There's also this piece around governments, right? And so there is, yes, I think oftentimes this particular conversation not from a political standpoint, but from an organizing standpoint. How do we recruit more people? How do we have public dialogue? It gets very sticky because to say anything, to make any criticism, you are then called anti-Semitic, and you are, and it's like, that's not what's happening. For me, I am interested in being able to offer criticism, as you said, of a government and of a military that, for as far as I can see, is not acting in a way that is fair and just and humane. And I think the same thing is what Black Lives Matter is demanding from this government, right? It is about saying our lives must matter, and there are very clear ways that should happen in the public domain, right? That we should be free of police terror, that we should be free of extrajudicial practices, that we should be free of the fear of living, the fear of going to sleep and not waking up. And I think, again, when it comes to the actions of governments, like we have to hold those who are in power and those who wield extraordinary amounts of power. We have to hold them accountable. And so I think the call for support for folks in Palestine for me is about that. It's about saying we have a government that is acting in ways that's just like, both, there is the history part, which you and I talked about, and so many people don't fully understand that. And so one does not have to be a historian to take action. One can look at the images, one can read the news and say, wow, this is a really imbalanced fight, and the force with a lot of power is really acting in ways that we should question, similarly to how we question the actions of the US government and the US police in regards to Black lives in this country.
Right. I think what I also appreciate about the work that you and our team continue to do, addressing use of force here in this city and of course in our nation, is just the ability to, as you've said, to organize and to help raise consciousness for what is use of force, the imbalance of power, as you've already noted. And I think a lot of times folks feel helpless, that I don't have the tools to be engaged with a movement to address something so systematic and systemic. And what are some universal tools, perhaps, that could be offered to those that see this use of force, this imbalance of power, and this perpetuation of oppression, to be able to speak out, to engage, and also to make the connection spiritually? And we can come back to that part. But as an organizer, what lens can we put on to be able to respond to the violence that we see against our Palestinian family?
I'm trying to think. One of the first time I went to a rally or a protest, I didn't fully understand what I was doing, and I didn't necessarily have a politic around it. I saw lots of people in the street, and something compelled me to be part of that. And I said, if these many people are here showing up, raising concerns, I want to learn more. And so I think the first thing is sort of, I'm not sure if it's a tool, but it is an approach. It is the call of entry, right? That so many people are raising their voices. So if people are listening, so many people are raising their voices. So many people, trusted people, are saying this is not okay. I invite people to have a posture of openness, to listen and to say, these are folks I trust. These are people who've raised criticisms in other areas and around other topics that I am inclined to believe. So let me lean in to learn more. The second piece, as in terms of approach, is that, again, we don't have to be historians. And people often say, hey, let me read more. And it's like, No, I think some of these images are compelling enough to say this action is not okay and is not in line with our expectations, again, of how government and democratic government should function. The third piece is the willingness to show up. And we're in a moment where showing up looks like, sharing information, if not on your social media, with your loved ones, in your WhatsApp groups, in your group chats, right? Have you seen this? Take a look at this. I am concerned. But also your social media. Also, there are in a number of places, particularly in this country, when things are happening, people are showing up more and more physically in person. And so there may be opportunities to show up and to stand in solidarity. But for me as an organizer, what seems most critical now is how do we recruit more people to the side of demanding that the humanity and the history and the land of the Palestinian people is actually honored and respected. And so that is the work of organizing, of recruiting more and more and more people to our side of the argument. And so for people who are showing up in person, as an organizer, I go, when you leave that rally, how many people are you going to share the images with and say, hey, I was here today and here's what I learned. And will you join me in doing this thing? Because that is how we build popular support for an idea. And I think that's the organizer in me, that yes, we have to show up, but we become organizers and we start organizing when we do not show up alone, and we accept the call or the invitation to go get other people. And it doesn't have to be 1,000 other people, but it could be one more person, 5 more people, 10 more people. But that is how we grow the will of the body politic, if you will, to demand that things be handled differently, particularly from the side of the U.S. government, right? Because we can hold our government accountable to how it shows up in the region.
Right, right. I love that. I think those could be really helpful steps. Especially, I appreciate not overwhelming ourselves to think that our action has to be so big, so macro, but we can look at a micro scale just within our network and begin there. But also a theme that I've heard from others in these conversations is the interconnectedness. I love what you said. We're not alone. We're not showing up alone. We're doing this work in community, even if it's 1 or 2 others that's joining us, or your friends on your social media platform. This is a community that we're building. And you serve as an organizer, a manager for organizing and policymaking for Community Renewal Society, which is a faith-based organization that's committed to social justice. And we lift up beloved community in all that we do. How do we speak to faith-based communities that may say that's a political issue? What does that have to do with beloved community? What does that have to do with we should have the separation of church and state, if you will.
It's always intriguing to me. Finish. I'm sorry.
No. How do we have that conversation?
That people still, I'm always intrigued when people say that, right? Whenever people say to me, for example, they are a Christian, these days, I ask them, what is it that they believe? Because there are lots of versions of Christianity running around the place. But if you are a Christian, right? There's a time when I was an undergrad where people weren't Christians, they were spiritualists, all sorts of different things. But if you claim some relationship to the Christian story and to the Christian tradition, to say, what does politics have to do with my faith, strikes me as odd and strikes me as ahistorical. Why? Because the central figure of the Christian story is crucified as a political act, right? He's crucified at the behest of a government, right? And so that is the start of the Christian story. And it is around that public political discipline in that this thing that we call Christianity emerges. So that's the first piece, that's not the history. The second piece for me is that everything is political, right? We live in a more and more both political and globalized world. And so it's difficult to take away how my faith shows, how I live my faith from the political decisions that are happening around me. And those who say they are doing that are often being dishonest. Like there's no action, there's no decision. Participating or not participating is a political choice, particularly now. One doesn't have to be partisan, however, right? One doesn't have to be, in our case, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian. Like one doesn't have to be that, right, to show up. But in terms of political, our decisions are made by the political powers that be. And we have to, our lives are governed by those decisions and we have to interact with them. And I think our people's faith calls them, again, to make right, this is Christian story, crooked pathways, right? And when I think about what is happening in the region, when I think about what is happening related to Black Lives Matter, there is no doubt in my mind that there is some crookedness here. And that as people of faith, faith invites us to participate in making crooked paths straight, making broken lives and broken communities whole. And so for me, those things are not even connected. They are one and the same, because the origins of this thing that we call Christianity, and so many of our faith traditions, they begin in deeply, deeply political moments. And we are called, I think, to a similar kind of practice.
Yes, that's powerful. Powerful, and I love that imagery, quoting the scripture, making the crooked path straight, and being voices in the wilderness. Yeah. Having the courage and the moral authority to speak out when there is a breach of justice, to turn over those tables. And I think that if there ever was an urgency of now, this moment that we're in collectively with Asian American and Pacific Islanders, with Palestinians, with Blacks' bodies and indigenous communities in the US, like this is a moment for that rainbow coalition to rise up in solidarity and to insist on freedom for us all. From a pastoral lens, what would be your message to encourage two groups? I mean, there's so many groups, but particularly I'm asking for these two groups, those that will choose to march, but maybe, as you said, be labeled as anti-Semitic or criticized for choosing to resist and to speak out. And for our Palestinians who need to know that there's a movement for Black and Brown lives that's in solidarity with their work.
And I think you said it, for Palestinians who are in this moment, living in duress, and again, wherever people fall, the images are terrifying. And there's a way in which saying we send love, we send support, there's a way in which that falls to the ground, because you're like, there is such deep suffering, and what have we to contribute to that? And so I'm not sure. I honestly, I am hurt. My heart is broken, and I want to have a message, but I don't know what that message is. What I can say is to folks who live, particularly on this side of the world, who are witnessing and have power and citizenship and participate in this democracy, I think we have a responsibility to both speak up, but to reach out to our leaders and to say, we have to play a different role in the region. And we have that responsibility. And for people who will show up and be labeled, it takes courage to act. And so often when we act, mislabeled and we are misidentified. And again, I don't know that I have a message of for that. You know, it happens. The simplest phrase that has come out of the last 2 decades, Black Lives Matter, to think that could have become such a political like landmine, you know, like people lost their jobs, people were labeled as all sorts of things. In the 70s and 80s, the Black Power movement, like to say Black Power meant you were some. So there have been these moments in history where people are struggling for the full freedom and liberation of people and trying to be on the right side. The mislabeling is part of the journey. It is part of the experience. It is a part of what happens. But go show up, even if we are afraid. Fear keeps us alert. Fear keeps us connected. Fear keeps us sometimes in search of community. And so that thing you feel, that trepidation you feel, it's part of it. And I wish there was something I could say to you to say, oh, no, because you are engaging in a politicized struggle, and it is not our fault that it is politicized. And so what they call you, how they label you, yes, worry about it, but look at history. Lots of people have been mislabeled. They mislabeled Jesus. And so if we got to take up the cross, you know, I don't know, I want to say something more, but we got to take up this cross and we have to speak up. But you are not alone. There are lots of people who are supporting and showing up and raising fists and demanding truth. And if organizing and history tells us anything, if the end of slavery, if the end of chain gangs in the US, if the end of apartheid in South Africa, if the end of women not having the right to vote, if marriage equality tells us anything, it is that freedom is a constant struggle. And when we struggle over time with lots and lots of people locked arm in arm, we eventually win. And that is my hope, you know, and that is my invitation. So.
Ashe, Ashe. And Jesus was a Palestinian Jew, right. You know, so you can't, you know, so you can't even be, find a greater example than the resistance that Jesus demonstrated in his ministry and calling. Thank you so much, Keron, for just the power of your voice, the power of your work, and the ways that you inspire us to organize, to be engaged, to not look away, but to share in that moral responsibility and accountability for one another in this global diaspora that we live in. Yeah, I'm really grateful for your work, and blessings and peace to those who may be inspired by your words.
Thank you.